Welcome to Podcast Circle. I am the creator and host, Alex Hitt. On each episode of Podcast Circle, we bring together a group of entrepreneurs and business owners to have roundtable discussions about our experiences building and running businesses today. While I host and moderate the conversation, the views and opinions expressed by each guest are their own. I do not endorse any products, services, or advice shared on the podcast unless explicitly stated. With that said, let's jump into our introduction so you know who has joined us today.
Lorenz, Top Floor Mentoring, topfloormentoring.com.
John Montague, Executive Focus, executivefocus.io.
Dan Norton with Partner Ally. It's partner-ally.com.
The topic of discussion today is, what's the best book you've ever read and why? Laura, would you please start us off?
I had to think long and hard about this one because I've read so many really, really good books. But the one that really stands out for me is Simon Sinek's Start With Why. And this is what he says in the book. I'm just going to summarize it real quick. We're all really good at talking about what we do and how we do it. But very few people can articulate and say with any passion why they do what they do. And it's not about money. It's really about, why do you get out of bed in the morning? Why should anybody care about your company? And if you can figure this out for yourself, it actually helps you then message yourself better, and it helps people who feel the same way as you will then gravitate towards you. So again, great book. Highly recommend reading it.
This is a tough question because I agree with Laura. I've read so many books. It was very, very difficult to pick one, but the one I'm going to pick today is The Outsiders by William Thorndike. It's a fantastic book about 8 unconventional CEOs and their radically rational approach to success. And they do this through how they do capital allocation. This is a topic that a lot of people may have heard of, but don't really understand. It's a fascinating romp through these 8 different CEOs and how they looked at capital allocation. I'm a lifelong investor, and I just learned a tremendous amount of information from this book. For example, I've always wondered why you see so many CEOs today use their capital to buy their own stock when their stock's really high, which is kind of brain dead, because they, more than anybody else, should know that when their stock's really low and they believe in their company, that's the time for their shareholders and for themselves that they should be buying their stock with their money. And they never do. They do almost the opposite most of the times. And those are really poor capital allocators and bad CEOs, in my humble opinion. But the book exemplifies this almost better than anything I've ever read. It's a fantastic read. You can't put it down, and it's worth taking a look at.
Yeah, the book that comes to mind for me, just because I've been able to actually leverage this book with clients and myself, is called Clockwork. And the one thing that stands out to me about this book, other than as very usable concepts that you can actually extract and put into practice right away, is his view on roles. It's really helped me to reframe my view of how roles fit within positions that then fit within the organization. And so really redefining roles and what do those mean, and how do you leverage that to kind of reorganize your approach to the company. It's been very powerful for me.
So my favorite book is called The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem by Nathaniel, Branden. And I think it actually does relate to business, because our self-esteem has a really big effect on our self-worth. I guess that they're kind of synonyms, right? Some quotes that I really like from the book are, self-esteem is the reputation we acquire of ourselves. And there is overwhelming evidence that the higher the level of our self-esteem, the more likely we are to treat others with respect, kindness, and generosity. And I think the topic is talked about a lot, but it's not very often understood. And he does a really amazing job just breaking it down. It's kind of like How to Win Friends and Influence People, but for yourself. You listen to How to Win Friends and Influence People, and you're like, I know all this stuff. It's intuitive, right? If you were maybe raised right? It's like, oh, this is obvious, right? Same thing with Nathaniel Branden's 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem. And he has another book called The Psychology of High Self-Esteem. And self-esteem, I think, is just so important. And I think like I said, a lot of people maybe think they know what it's about, but they've never really understood it to maybe the in-depth level that Nathaniel Branden goes into in his book. So I just think it's really amazing and transformed my life. And it actually helped me, like he says, treat other people with more kindness, respect, and generosity. So that's why I really love the book. But any additional thoughts or insights on, what was mentioned here today?
I would like to circle back to what Laura brought up with book on why. And I will say that in approaching just about any strategic initiative down to some tactical measure, or even on the personal side when dealing with business leaders and looking at their personal strategic plan or or core purpose, really circling back to that why is so powerful. And I would agree with her that it's a very important concept that's very widely applicable. Really enjoy that you brought up that book.
He's clearly got his why down right so well. And it's so impactful. The stories that he tells about business owners that really understood their why and how effective that made them at being able to actually get clients, but not just get clients, but to retain these clients and to be able to talk about the business in a much more effective way. Alex, I had a follow-up to your book because I think that a lot of business owners don't look at that side of themselves. They're always very focused on the tactical and strategic things that they can do, but without having the right mindset and going to work every day being generous to other people, their businesses are not going to be as powerful as they could be. So having the self-esteem and making sure that that's there is super important to business as well.
Yeah. He says the most important judgment we will pass in our life is the judgment we pass on ourselves. And so often the judgment that we have on ourselves is the most inaccurate judgment we make. And so I think that's super important. And your self-worth, how much you think you're worth, how much money you think you're worth is so tied to your self-esteem. So super, super important. But John, you had something to add here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add a couple of things on Laura's comments. Simon Sinek's a fascinating guy. I'm a huge fan. And some people don't know some of his backstory, but he actually used to have a marketing agency. And it was a reasonably successful agency. But then he stumbled when he split with his business partner. And if anybody's ever had a business with a business partner and things start to go south, it can get pretty ugly pretty quick. And he was really struggling and failing, and he was hiding it. And this is a very common behavior. But there's a fantastic interview with him with Scott Galloway. I'm certainly not a fan of everything Scott does, but he's interesting to say the least. And he did a fantastic interview with Simon Sinek that's worth checking out, where he tells that story very vulnerably about how he was screwing up big time. And a lot of us are afraid to share our failures. And as I tell younger CEOs that I meet, I will share with you every mistake I've ever made so you don't make those mistakes. And hopefully you can go on and make smaller ones on your own. But you got to learn from them and grasp them and move on. And Simon Sinek just does a fantastic job of telling those stories and sharing some of those vulnerabilities. I think he's a really interesting guy.
Yeah, I would bring up also, if you want to apply some of those lessons about the why, if you look at Gary Sanchez has a why institute. If you go through that assessment, you can kind of distill that into something that's applicable to you very easily through that tool.
Well, I want to unpack this a little bit. We talk a lot about why. A lot of people talk about why. And I think it's kind of like talking about identity, which identity is a hard thing to understand because you can't point to your identity. You can't put your identity in a jar. It's this kind of intangible thing that's kind of amorphous and ever changing, right? So just help me understand this, because I don't dive into the idea of why, and that's not something that I'm super knowledgeable about. So help me understand that concept a little bit more of what is the why and how do we define it? Yeah, go ahead, John.
So sometimes when I'm working with younger people in their careers, Simon Sinek was telling a story about he was working with this person about 3 to 4 years out of college. Very bright individual, was working at this company. They'd been at the company 8 months, and he said, "How's things going?" And they said, "Well, I think I'm going to quit." And he said, "Why?" I just don't think I'm, I just don't think I'm making a difference. And what this individual is doing is they're looking at the mountain and all they see is the summit, and they're not at the summit. And they don't realize that, every day you just got to make little gains, and that's how you build a life. That's how you build a career. You don't start at the top. And there's a fantastic book about Facebook. It talks about Mark Zuckerberg, and everybody thinks Mark Zuckerberg was this overnight success. He was an 8-year overnight success. That company struggled every week to buy more servers. His parents lent him over $80,000 to buy servers. I wouldn't lend my kid $80,000 to buy more servers, but it's a fantastic example that he kept going, trying to build it a day at a time, a week at a time, and a month at a time. And there's so many of our young people that struggle with that today because they hear about somebody on social media and they think they're an instant success. They're not. And where you don't have to come up with this super powerful thing to get meaning in your life. Mine was, I want to work hard and I want to learn. And I'm a lifelong learner. And so I will go way down the rabbit hole when I find things of interest. But you have to just take it a step at a time. A successful life is built over 20 years, not over 2 hours. And so that's one way I just try to share some things with some of the younger people as they're starting their career to how to think about it. And I hope that helps some of them.
One of the other examples that he uses in the why is he tells a story about this hugely professional, successful violinist. And they ask, why do you do what you do? Because he'll play in the subways for free. And yet he plays, I can't remember what orchestra, but it's a very big, large orchestra, and he makes lots of money. And he says, because I want to have the impact of having one child understand how powerful music can be in their lives. So that's his why.
Yeah, I was going to bring up, as far as leveraging this also, when you talk to leaders and organizations and business, and it always helps to understand the person on the other end of the conversation or the initiative or wherever you're leading. And I've heard of concrete examples, and the one I'll bring up is Bob Glazer. His entire organization knows their why and knows the people's why around them. So when they interface with that individual or they look at what's motivating them, it helps considerably to understand why behind their approach or their actions or how you're going to connect with them. And so it can be a very useful tool in that regards.
Because communication is everything, whether in business or our personal life. If you understand the other person and where they come from, you can work with them much more effectively. I would say make it a priority to read in general, whether you're listening to Audible as reading, or you're picking up the book, or you're listening to podcasts, learning. If you keep learning, you keep getting better at what you do.
I would echo that with the following examples. Every one of my favorite billionaires reads. And so I think that's a good light to shine. There's a fascinating podcast run by a guy by the name of David Senra called Founders. It's through the Colossus podcast network, where he reads all these historical biographies and then he does a podcast about them, so that if you don't like to read, it's a way to not read, but still get a lot of the same information in there. And we live in a day and age where you can get access to people that you've never been able to get access before in life. And you will learn so much. It'll make your life richer. It'll help you hit your goals more easily. Any way that you like to learn, you have the opportunity to do that nowadays. And it's just a fantastic world that we live in, and take advantage of it if you have a chance.
Yeah, I would add to that everybody absorbs things differently, as everybody has mentioned, and has a different learning style. But I think that whatever you're reading or listening to, or how you're absorbing that, thinking about how that might be applicable to you, or even maybe somebody else in your life, I think can be very powerful. And it's hard to shine the spotlight on yourself, and it's hard to be realistic about how this might be applied to you, or maybe the subject that's being discussed can be applied to your life. But in my experience, it's better to take that time and reflect and look at, hey, how can this be applicable? And what does this mean to me? And does this challenge any of my assumptions about myself? I think that's an important step to consider.
That's a wrap for this episode of Podcast Circle. Thank you to all the guests for sharing their insights today. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening. Also, head over to my website, alexhitt.com, to find additional resources, to attend upcoming online events, and to apply to be the next guest on Podcast Circle.